The atmosphere inside the View studio crackled with an almost electric anticipation, the kind that buzzes in the air right before something unforgettable takes place. Cameras glided into their starting positions, producers whispered frantically into their headsets, and the studio audience settled into their seats with the eager expectancy of people who knew, instinctively, that today's show was about to deliver something extraordinary. It was supposed to be a routine episode, a polished daytime segment featuring light banter, witty jokes, and the usual blend of spirited discussion that the show was known for. But the universe had other plans, and no one, not even the show's most seasoned hosts, had any idea of the storm they were about to walk into. At the famous table, Joy Behar sat shuffling her notes with a look that was half amusement, half anticipation. Anyone who knew Joy well enough understood the meaning behind that particular smirk. She believed she was about to catch today's guest in a contradiction, and she was more than ready to pounce. The producers, seated behind their monitors in the control room, had booked a Hollywood legend, a man who had been charming audiences for nearly half a century, to promote his newest action-adventure film. The expectation was that the interview would be smooth, upbeat, and filled with the kind of warm nostalgia viewers loved. But the expectation was wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Harrison Ford. Whoopi Goldberg's voice rang out across the studio, smooth and commanding, and the audience erupted into applause. Harrison Ford walked onto the stage with the relaxed confidence of a man who had spent his entire adult life under bright lights. He waved, smiled, and took his seat with an ease that made everything seem ordinary, at least for the moment. His face, weathered from years of adventure films, flying aircraft, and a life lived boldly, carried the familiar half-smile that had charmed millions. Sarah Haynes greeted him warmly. "Harrison, welcome back to The View. It's always such a pleasure to have you here." "Thanks for having me," Ford replied in his unmistakably gravelly voice, settling back into his chair. "Though I have to admit, I'm always a little nervous sitting at this table. You ladies have quite the reputation for tough questions." The audience laughed, but Joy's eyes lit up with an intensity that suggested she was more than ready to validate Ford's concern. "Well, speaking of tough questions," Joy began, leaning forward, "I have to ask you about your recent comments on environmental activism." She lifted a sheet of paper dramatically. "You've been very vocal about climate change, yet you own multiple aircraft and fly them regularly. Isn't that a bit hypocritical?" A ripple of tension passed across the studio. Ford's smile thinned, his posture straightening almost imperceptibly. He didn't lash out or lose composure. He wasn't the type, but the shift in him was small, sharp, and impossible to miss. "Well, Joy," he said carefully, "that's a fair question, but it's also a bit more complicated than you're making it sound. I use my aircraft primarily for conservation work, transporting researchers and supplies to remote areas where environmental monitoring is being done. It's not exactly weekend Joy rides." "Oh, please," Joy scoffed, waving her hand as if brushing away smoke. "That's what every wealthy celebrity says when they get called out for their carbon footprint. You mean to tell me Harrison Ford, with all your resources, couldn't find more environmentally friendly ways to support conservation?" The studio temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Sunny Hostin shifted in her seat, trying to casually de-escalate with her body language. Alyssa Farah Griffin's eyes flickered wide, as if silently shouting, "This is going too far." This wasn't playful teasing anymore. This was Joy Behar sharpening a blade she fully intended to use. Ford's jaw flexed ever so slightly. When he spoke, his voice was still calm, but there was iron threaded through it now. "Actually, Joy, I've been involved in conservation work for more than 30 years. I've personally funded projects, supported global initiatives, and dedicated countless hours to the cause. Many of these locations can't be reached by commercial flights or by road. Sometimes specialized aircraft are the only option, but hey, I appreciate your concern for my carbon footprint." "Concern?" Joy laughed, an ugly, sarcastic sound that echoed through the studio. "I'm not concerned, Harrison. I'm calling you out. You Hollywood types love preaching to regular people about saving the planet while living in your giant mansions and flying around in private jets. It's always the same story." Ford blinked, the amusement gone, replaced by something colder. The audience fell into an uneasy silence. Even Whoopi, notoriously unshakable, leaned back with a look that said she knew things were about to unravel fast. The air felt tight, charged, like the moment before a thunderclap. Joy wasn't done, not even close. You sit here telling the world what they should do, she pushed on, while your lifestyle contradicts everything you claim to stand for. Ford leaned forward, eyes steady, voice low. Joy, I don't preach, I advocate. I support research. I fund action. I've put my own life on the line for conservation work. And yes, I fly, but I fly with purpose. Joy folded her arms, lifting her chin. Purpose or excuse, it sounds the same to me. That was the moment the audience would later describe in comments, reaction videos, and trending hashtags. The moment producers would replay in slow motion, wondering how they lost control so quickly. The moment that turned a routine interview into a viral grenade. And there, beneath the studio lights, in front of millions of viewers, daytime television exploded into one of its most unforgettable confrontations. The word hostile seemed to echo through the studio like a dropped piece of metal hitting a concrete floor. It rang sharp, startling, and impossible to ignore. A ripple of shock moved through the audience, some shifting in their seats, others gripping their armrests as if bracing themselves for what was coming next. The tension was no longer merely noticeable. It was thick, almost tangible, like a storm cloud settling over the room. Joy Behar wasn't used to being challenged, not like this, not by someone with Harrison Ford's gravitas, charisma, and calm steel. For a second, barely a fraction of a second, her expression faltered, uncertainty flickering across her features. But just as quickly, she rebuilt her armor, lifting her chin and narrowing her eyes as if preparing for a verbal duel she refused to lose. Ford remained composed, his posture relaxed but his gaze unwavering. He looked like a man who had dealt with thousands of confrontations in his lifetime, on film sets, in interviews, in real-world conservation territories, and wasn't about to be rattled by a TV host looking for a headline. It's virtue signaling at its finest, Joy had said earlier, her voice dripping with sarcasm, and the moment those words left her lips, the temperature in the studio had shifted. Even the crew members behind the cameras had frozen. Whoopi Goldberg, usually the calmest presence on the set, someone who could diffuse tension with a single joke or a raised eyebrow, seemed momentarily stunned. She glanced from Joy to Harrison, as if silently calculating how to steer the show back to somewhere safe. But safe was long gone. Ford had leaned forward, hands clasped loosely, his expression cool and measured. I think you have me confused with someone else, Joy, he said. I don't live in a mansion. I live on a ranch in Wyoming where I do actual conservation work. There had been a collective gasp, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, with quiet conviction and not a trace of defensiveness. Ford wasn't here to fight. He wasn't here to win. He was simply speaking truth with the authority of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I don't fly around in private jets for fun, he continued. I use aircraft as tools for my work, but more importantly, he paused, letting the silence tighten around his words, I don't come on television shows to attack people I've never met and know nothing about. If someone had dropped a pin in that studio, it would have sounded like a gunshot. Joy's face flushed red. Anger, embarrassment, pride, maybe all three tangling together. The camera captured every subtle twitch around her mouth. She wasn't used to this kind of pushback. She was used to steering the conversation, poking, prodding, teasing, provoking. But having the spotlight turned onto her behavior, that was rare, and it was clearly unbearable. She inhaled sharply, straightened her posture, and delivered her rebuttal with theatrical authority. Oh, I've been in this business longer than most people have been alive, Harrison. I know exactly what I'm talking about, and what I'm talking about is hypocrisy. Ford didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he lowered it, always more powerful than shouting. No, he said quietly, yet with the sharp precision of a blade slicing through fabric. What you're talking about is making assumptions, and attacking someone based on those assumptions. That's not journalism. That's just mean-spirited. The effect on the room was immediate and dramatic. Several members of the audience placed hands over their mouths. Sunny Hostin looked down at her lap, as if searching for a button. that would teleport her out of the studio. Alyssa Farah Griffin sat perfectly still, eyes darting like someone sitting in the front row of a theater watching a car crash in slow motion. Joy's mouth closed, then opened again, like a fish pulled out of water and gasping on a dock. For the first time in the entire segment, she looked unprepared, not because she lacked opinions. Joy always had opinions, but because Harrison Ford's response had cut deeper than expected. Mean-spirited. She finally sputtered, her voice cracking just a touch. "I'm asking legitimate questions about environmental responsibility." Ford studied her with a steady, almost clinical calm, as if evaluating her the way Indiana Jones might examine an artifact to determine whether it was authentic or a cheap imitation. "I can handle tough questions just fine, Joy," he said, leaning back with a confidence that felt effortless. "What I have trouble with is rudeness disguised as journalism." Boom. The studio didn't erupt, it imploded. Silence sucked the air out of the room. It was the kind of silence that precedes seismic shifts, the kind that shows are remembered for decades later. Joy, refusing to surrender, shot back, "If you can't handle tough questions, maybe you shouldn't come on talk shows." Her voice wobbled, though she tried desperately to hide it. Ford's expression didn't soften, didn't harden. It simply stayed focused, controlled. He tilted his head slightly, almost curious, like a hawk observing an opponent with more bark than bite. "There's a difference," he said calmly, "between asking hard questions and being deliberately hostile." And that single line, simple, logical, unshakable, was the exact moment the tide turned completely. The audience knew it, the hosts knew it, Joy knew it. The confrontation had gone from heated television drama to a full, blown public reckoning. Joy's voice shot up an entire octave, cracking under the strain of her rising frustration. "You think I'm being hostile?" she snapped, throwing her hands up. "I'm being real. I'm being honest. Something this town doesn't see enough of." The words reverberated through the studio like a badly tuned instrument, loud, sharp, and painfully off key. Harrison Ford turned his head slowly, almost theatrically, as if he needed time to process the claim. He repeated her words with deliberate slowness, each syllable landing with the weight of a hammer. "Being real." He said it like someone tasting something sour and trying to identify where it came from. The audience leaned forward in unison, completely hypnotized by the unfolding clash. "Is that what you call?" Ford continued, interrupting your guest, making accusations without a shred of fact, and generally behaving like you have some personal grudge against someone you've never even met. Gasps scattered across the studio like popping firecrackers. People weren't just watching a disagreement anymore, they were witnessing a full, blown intellectual boxing match, and the gloves had officially come off. Joy's complexion had shifted through several shades, pink, red, crimson, and was now settling somewhere close to purple. Her hands were clamped tightly onto the table, knuckles whitening beneath the studio lights. "I do not have a grudge against you," she spat out, each word squeezed through clenched teeth. "I have a problem with celebrities who think they can lecture the rest of us while living completely different lives." Ford didn't lean forward. He didn't point a finger. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he maintained that maddening, infuriating calm that only amplified the tension. "And I have a problem," he replied, "with talk show hosts who think they can attack their guests and call it entertainment." The silence that followed hit the room like a tidal wave. You could almost feel the air being sucked out of the studio. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to keep rolling. Joy's eyes flicked with spark, anger, embarrassment, disbelief, all tangled into something dangerous. When she spoke again, her voice was no longer theatrical or performative. It was venomous. "Attack," she hissed. "You think this is an attack? You clearly don't know what real journalism looks like, Harrison. Maybe you've been in Hollywood so long you're used to everyone kissing your feet and telling you how wonderful you are." The shot was personal, too personal, and the audience reacted instantly. A wave of uncomfortable murmurs swept across the room. Even the people who adored Joy were now shifting uneasily in their seats. Ford's eyebrows lifted just a fraction, the faintest hint of amusement flickering through his eyes. Not a laugh, not even a smile, just a subtle acknowledgement that Joy had swung hard, and still missed, actually Joy. He said, voice smooth as polished stone, "I've been doing interviews for over 40 years. I know the difference between a journalist asking tough questions and someone who's simply looking for a fight. He let that hang. 1 second, 2, 3, right now. He finished. You're looking for a fight. Joy slammed a hand onto the table, not enough to be dramatic, but enough to betray the panic edging into her frustration. I'm looking for honesty, she shot back, her pitch climbing higher. Honesty, something that seems to be in very short supply whenever celebrities come on these shows. Ford remained unfazed. It was almost eerie how composed he looked next to her boiling anger. His calm was not passive, it was a weapon. You want honesty? He asked quietly. Joy opened her mouth, but Ford didn't give her the chance to answer. You want to talk about conservation work? Fine. Let's talk about the years I've spent funding environmental research. Let's talk about the organizations I've supported long before social media made activism trendy. Let's talk about the actual scientists I've flown into remote areas because commercial planes cannot land there. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut sharper than any shout. Joy rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, please, you want to talk about your little conservation work? Fine. Let's talk about the fuel consumption of those planes you're so proud of flying around. The audience recoiled as if she'd crossed an invisible line, because she had, and that was the moment Whoopi Goldberg finally stepped in. Joy, Whoopi said, her voice low but commanding, an unmistakable warning tone she rarely used on air. Joy, okay, enough. But Joy wasn't listening. The adrenaline, the tension, the cameras, the need to win, it had all taken hold. She turned toward Whoopi briefly, frustration flashing across her face. What, I'm asking questions? Isn't that what we do here? Questions, yes. Whoopi said. Intimidation, no. We're going in circles now. Joy looked as if she were ready to argue with Whoopi too, but she never got the chance. Because Harrison Ford spoke again quietly, simply, but with such clarity that the entire room snapped to attention. Joy, he said, you're not asking questions, you're trying to provoke a reaction. He paused, one eyebrow raised just slightly. And for the record, you're doing a very good job. A ripple of laughter, more cautious, spread across the audience, not because Ford was trying to be funny, but because the tension had become so intense that people needed some way to release it. Joy, however, did not laugh. Her jaw tightened. Whoopi leaned forward, placing a steadying hand on the table. Okay, she said firmly. Let's bring this back down. But it was too late. The argument had reached its boiling point, and the studio was already bracing for the explosion. Maybe we should, Whoopi suggested gently, trying to ease the tension before it snapped completely. But Joy didn't even let her finish. No. The word shot out like a bullet. She didn't turn her head, didn't acknowledge Whoopi at all. Her eyes were locked on Ford with an almost feverish determination. I'm not done. The audience gasped, not loudly, but with the kind of shocked inhale that comes from witnessing something you're not sure you're supposed to see. Harrison, Joy continued, her voice sharpened to a dangerous point. How much fuel does one of your aircraft burn in a single flight? Do you even know? Do you even care? Her tone twisted the questions into accusations, as if she were cross, examining him in a courtroom rather than interviewing him on national television. Harrison Ford didn't respond immediately. He studied her, really studied her, with an expression that mixed patience, disappointment, and a hint of sadness. It was the look of someone who had hoped for a genuine conversation, but realized he was dealing with something entirely different. A Cessna 180 burns about 12 gallons per hour, Ford said calmly. His voice carried that measured rhythm of a man who is used to facts, not theatrics. If you're really interested in the specifics, my larger aircraft, the one I use for longer conservation missions, yes, it burns more. Joy's eyes gleamed like she had caught him in a trap, but... Ford continued before she could pounce. It also allows me to transport equipment and personnel that would otherwise require multiple vehicles or be completely inaccessible by road. Sometimes there are no roads. Sometimes you have to go where no car or commercial flight can reach. He paused just long enough for the meaning to sink in, but something tells me, he added, you're not really interested in the actual details. Oh, I'm very interested. Joy shot back instantly, her lips curling into a triumphant, nasty smile. 12 gallons an hour, that's more fuel than most people use in their cars in an entire week. She leaned forward like a predator closing in. And you're out there lecturing people about environmental impact? Ford blinked once, just once. Not in shock, not in irritation, but in that calm, maddeningly steady way of a man who has been through every kind of confrontation imaginable and still refuses to be rattled. I'm not lecturing anyone, he replied evenly, almost gently. I work with conservation organizations. I fund scientific research, and yes, sometimes that work requires transportation. Transportation that isn't always environmentally perfect, but it serves a purpose greater than convenience. The audience murmured, the tension rising like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Ford tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing just a fraction. But I'm curious, Joy. His tone sharpened. What's your environmental footprint? Joy stiffened. How did you get to work today? The studio erupted into a chorus of gasps, whispers, and stunned groans. It was the kind of moment daytime television producers dream of, the kind that would be clipped, shared, analyzed, and replayed millions of times across social media. Joy opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her jaw moved, then froze again. That's not the point. She finally stammered, stumbling over her words. I'm not the one going around giving speeches about climate change. Actually. Ford allowed the hint of a smile. A small, knowing, unmistakably lethal smile. You are making it the point. Joy's nostrils flared. She wasn't used to having her own tactics turned back on her. She wasn't used to being caught off balance. And she definitely wasn't used to being confronted with her own inconsistencies on live television. You're accusing me, Ford continued, of not living a perfectly carbon-neutral life while doing conservation work. But unless you walked here barefoot eating air for breakfast, your choices have environmental impacts too. A ripple of laughter, uneasy, nervous, almost guilty, ran through the audience. Joy's expression twisted, something between outrage and humiliation. I'm not the one with multiple aircraft, she snapped. Ford nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the point, but refusing to let it stand unchecked. And yet, he said softly, you feel entitled to judge my entire life, my work, and my motives based on one talking point you didn't bother to research beyond a headline. Another gasp, another blow. Another moment where Joy's defenses visibly crumbled under the weight of his calm, unshakable logic. Joy opened her mouth again, searching for a comeback, a jab, something. But Ford spoke first, his tone steady but firm. Joy, attacking without understanding isn't journalism. He leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on hers. It's theater, and not the good kind. Joy recoiled as if she'd been physically struck. Whoopi tried again, her voice tense. Okay, let's... But Ford wasn't finished. You asked me if I care, he said, voice low but powerful. Yes, I care enough to devote decades of my life, my time, and my money to conservation, and I care enough to answer your questions, even when they're laced with hostility. He paused, allowing the silence to stretch. What I don't care for, he concluded, is being misrepresented by someone who isn't asking for truth, but for drama. And just like that, the room fell into another heavy, breathless silence. Joy's face hardened, her jaw set, but her eyes told the truth. She had been shaken, cornered, and called out in a way she never expected, and the audience knew this was far from over. That is exactly the point, Ford replied, his voice calm but edged with unmistakable firmness. You're criticizing me for something you clearly don't understand, while openly admitting that you don't hold yourself to the same standards. If anything sounds like hypocrisy here, it isn't coming from my side of the table. Joy's face twisted into something close to fury. Her eyes widened, her lips tightened, and a flush crept up her neck. The studio lights made the tension even more visible. Don't you dare try to turn this around on me, she snapped, jabbing a finger in his direction. I am not the one sitting here pretending to be some environmental saint while burning through fossil fuels like there's no tomorrow. Ford didn't flinch. His expression barely changed. If Joy had hoped her outburst would rattle him, it failed spectacularly. Environmental saint, he repeated, his tone still level, but now carrying a subtle undercurrent of steel. Joy, I've never claimed to be perfect. Not once. I've never claimed to be a saint, either. I'm just someone who cares about conservation. Someone who puts real time, real effort, and real money into supporting it. But for some reason, you seem determined to paint me as a villain simply because the work I do requires certain tools, tools that help get the job done. Tools, Joy repeated with an outraged laugh, sharp, bitter, and theatrical enough to make a few audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Is that what we're calling private aircraft now? Tools for what? Your personal convenience. Ford took a steady breath, refusing to rise to the bait. A saw is a tool, he said patiently. A hammer is a tool, a vehicle is a tool, an aircraft is also a tool. They're all instruments that allow you to accomplish specific tasks. The real question is whether the task justifies the cost and effort. In my case, the conservation work I'm involved in has helped protect hundreds of thousands of acres of wilderness, supported environmental research, and aided species preservation efforts. If using an aircraft allows me to do that effectively, then yes, I'm comfortable with the math. Comfortable with the math, Joy repeated with exaggerated mockery, crossing her arms. How convenient. I bet you're comfortable with a lot of things, especially when you can afford to be. It must be nice to lecture the world from a position of luxury. At this point, the atmosphere around the table had shifted dramatically. The other hosts, initially fascinated, now looked genuinely uneasy. Sarah Haynes kept fidgeting with the cue cards in her lap, flipping them back and forth, as though searching for an escape route. Sunny host avoided looking directly at either of the two combatants and focused on an imaginary point on the table. Even Whoopi, usually unshakable, seemed momentarily at a loss for how to intervene. The tension thickened to the point where the studio's hum and the movement of the cameras felt strangely loud. Ford exhaled slowly and adjusted in his seat. His patience, though still intact, now showed visible strain. "You know what, Joy," he said, his tone finally reflecting a hint of exasperation. "I came here to talk about a movie, to have a thoughtful conversation with intelligent people about work I care about, both the film and the environmental projects I support. I did not come here to be ambushed by someone who seems to have a personal vendetta against anyone who's actually trying to make a positive difference in the world." Vendetta, Joy repeated, her voice cracking slightly, betraying that the confrontation was affecting her more deeply than she intended to show. She leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "You think this is personal. This isn't personal. This is principle. This is about calling out the hypocrisy that runs rampant in Hollywood. Someone has to say it." "No," Ford answered firmly, his tone dropping into something quieter, heavier, and unmistakably real. "This is personal." Joy blinked, thrown off for the first time. Ford continued before she could interrupt. "If this were about principle," he said, keeping his voice steady and controlled, "you would have asked your questions with an open mind. You would have listened to the answers. You would have evaluated the information. But you've made it clear from the start that you're not interested in facts. You came into this segment with your conclusions already written, your accusations already prepared. You didn't ask me about conservation efforts because you wanted to understand them. You asked because you wanted a moment, just a moment, where you could take a shot at someone in front of an audience." He leaned forward slightly, not threateningly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew he was standing on solid ground. "That isn't principle, that's personal." Joy opened her mouth, but no words came out immediately. Her jaw worked, her face tense, but the sharp, rehearsed retorts she had relied on throughout the interview seemed suddenly out of reach. Ford pressed gently but firmly. "There's a difference between accountability and antagonism, between genuine concern and performative outrage. I'm all for accountability. I welcome it. But what you're doing isn't that. What you're doing is taking cheap shots to score a moment of shock value. And honestly, it undermines the real conversations we should be having about environmental responsibility." The studio was silent, truly silent. Even the audience, previously reacting with whispers and shifting movements, now sat frozen. Joy swallowed hard, clearly struggling to regain control of the moment. Her voice, when it finally returned, was smaller. "You think you can sit there and rewrite what this conversation is about?" Ford shook his head. "No, I think the conversation revealed exactly what it was about all along."